Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry to interrupt what are doubtless much more interesting conversations than what we're going to be doing up here. But I suppose we were asked to provide some entertainment here at lunchtime. Originally, the plan was to have four post-liberals here. John Askinus, some of you may don't know John Askinus of Catholic University, but who's currently working for the State Department, as one does. He's off to Berlin this morning, so he was unable to join us. So I've asked Gabrielle Groh, who is a graduate student studying with me at the University of Notre Dame, not to play the part of John, but rather to play the part of a moderator, to pose some questions to us. Feel free to pose some follow-ups if necessary. Remember that I do your fate hangs, so don't be too tough on us. But just to introduce Gabby, and then she'll introduce us. Gabby Groh is a third-year doctoral student at the University of Notre Dame, where she's studying constitutional studies and political theory. She's holds a Notre Premier Fellowship, which is one of our most prestigious, sought-after prizes for graduate students. And her research focuses on the areas of community, religion, and virtue within liberal constitutional orders. This is kind of interesting, and I only learned this the other day. Before coming to us, she worked at the University of Chicago for the economist Steve Levitt, famous from the Freakonomics book, related to projects touching on agriculture and K through 12 education. She holds a degree from Stanford University, and with her husband, Nathan, lives in South Bend and spends time, not in South Bend, on her family farm in Illinois, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yep.
So Gabby, thank you for agreeing to do this today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really a privilege to be up here and to introduce our three distinguished panelists, Professor Deneen, Dr. Pecknold, and then Dr. Gladden Pappin. Professor Deneen is a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. Previously, he taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University. He is the author and editor of 8 books, including the 2018 bestseller, Why Liberalism Failed, which has been translated into over 20 languages at this point. Along with the other members of this panel, he is a co-founder and author of the Substack publication, The Post-Liberal Order. And I also just have to add that as an advisor, Professor Deneen is very kind and generous, and we are very grateful to have him at Notre Dame.
Don't destroy my reputation. I'm cruel.
Next, we have Dr. Chad Pecknold, who earned his PhD from Cambridge University, where he wrote his dissertation on Augustine and post-liberal theology. He went on to write a book on Christianity and politics, a subject he has now taught on for almost 20 years at the Catholic University of America. He has been a regular contributor to debates in the public square and was also a co-founder of the Substack Post-Liberal Order. His most recent book, Fire on the Altar, examines Augustine's Confessions as a masterpiece at the roots of Western civilization. Last but not least, we have Gladden Pappin, who is the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, which he has led since 2023. And in that capacity, he is a key advisor to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He co-founded American Affairs in 2017 and later the Post-Liberal Order. Along the way, he co-founded Realm Alliance, a technology company dedicated to industrial security. He received his AB and PhD from Harvard, where he was an ISI Honors Fellow in 2002 and later an ISI Western Civilization Fellow. So we have a few questions for each of the panelists and then a couple of questions for all the panelists, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Professor Deneen, let's start with you. First question, what is post-liberalism? And why has this term become so widely used today?
When I began just graduate students out there, when I began my graduate studies, I never expected, what I expected was I would spend my life studying other thinkers. I never expected that I would reach a point where people were studying my thinking. Even in the last few days, a number of journals have been published with themed articles on post-liberalism. Conferences are being held around the world on post-liberalism. Books are being written on post-liberalism. I should add, not all friendly. In fact, many of them not very friendly. But nevertheless, it's a very odd situation to be in for me, not expecting to reach a point in my career where I would become associated with a term that now is a subject of fascination in the intellectual sphere. I think it's become somewhat prevalent in wider usage, first of all, and most obviously because of the now widely understood and accepted understanding that the liberal order is failing, has failed. Its fundamental features are no longer operative, no longer capable of achieving the ends that in some ways ends that it actually did set out to achieve, but which have turned out to be unsustainable as a kind of political governing order. The panel that just preceded this one, I think, touches on, in this room, touches on one of the key aspects, the idea that a nation is merely an idea or a set of principles and not a people. Not a people and a tradition and a history that requires some sense of that which we share in common. A political order needs to have not just real borders, but in some sense, psychic borders of tradition and culture and inheritance. So in the first place, the idea of a borderless world, you could say one of the core aspects of the liberal imagination, has now been rejected. Secondly, we've seen, of course, a rejection of what's sometimes called neoliberalism, or simply a kind of classical liberal idea of a borderless economy, an economy in which all goods and services and even human beings are fungible, viewed as being fungible, in which no concern for national security, productivity within a nation, essential forms of manufacturing, and just simply the need to ensure that one's population is able to have dignified forms of work and be able to sustain a life, raising a family, bringing a family into the world with a degree of security. Of course, what we've seen in the heartland of the country, the devastation, the world that J.D. Vance came from, is indicative of that aspect of liberalism's failure. The rejection, I think, we've seen in the last few years of the idea that one could impose liberalization through means of military force, through force of arms, that we could force in a sense, or create liberalism, establish liberalism in any place, in any time of our choosing, has run into the reality, as John Agresto once said, that one gets mugged by reality when one attempts to do that. That it's simply not the case that liberalism is just a set of ideas that can just be imposed. It requires a certain kind of a culture, a certain kind of history. And what we now recognize is that by rejecting or overlooking that aspect, the kind of military adventurism of the last several decades has led to a terrible pass. And lastly, the rejection of the idea, touching on themes that Tim Burns has so eloquently talked about, rejecting the idea that simply human freedom requires the mastery of nature, that technology and freedom are fundamentally work in tandem with each other. And I think we see that, of course, we see that being played out for those concerns of people on the left with the concerns over the crisis of the natural order, environmentalism. But we see it, of course, also playing out in the ways in which the human body increasingly is seen as an elastic or plastic, a kind of an object of human technological intervention, mastery, and perfection. And I think that aspect, especially as we saw the rise of a kind of trans movement, the idea that the human body was simply plastic, could be infinitely manipulable, has led to the conclusion that this project, in so many ways, is no longer acceptable. So I think what we're seeing is a time of tumult and a time of openness to questions that weren't really being asked for a long time, either on the left or the right, which is what are the alternatives, and particularly in the American context, what are the alternatives to what was seen as the sort of default order of America, even to the point where we had simply concluded, or many had concluded, we were at the end of history. History has started again, and the question going forward, what will be the post-liberal future into which we find ourselves living?
So in your mind, what is your particular version of post-liberalism? How would you articulate that? And how does it differ from other versions of conservatism?
Yeah, so when I say that we are entering a post-liberal moment, there are many, many versions of what that will look like. There's of course, in its own way, we've already lived through a certain kind of post-liberalism, which is what we now call illiberal liberalism or illiberal progressivism. Now, many, and perhaps many in this room, would argue, well, that wasn't liberalism, that was Marxism, that was cultural Marxism. But I think this was really just a kind of liberalism on steroids. Right? It was the idea that we no longer had to think about or consider the past as relevant to who we are as human beings, that the past was a kind of time of darkness and backwardness, and if we cut off the heads of statues of Columbus and threw them into topic I just saw on social media today, that Columbus statues are apparently being revived. Heads are being replaced. So that if somehow we could overcome the darkness of the past, we could live in a present of thoroughgoing freedom, equality, without any of the darkness of the past. So there are forms of post-liberalism. On the left, there's a form of post-liberalism on the right that I find particularly worrisome, a kind of Nietzschean vitalism that I think we see especially popular among some young men, very online young men, that if the kind of progressive post-liberalism takes the form of having the desire for equality, even to the point where it's willing to eliminate certain kinds of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so forth. We should understand that vitalism is willing to, and indeed desires to have freedom to the point of extinguishing human equality. So these are two forms of post-liberalism that I find to be quite worrisome. Now, again, for many then, the answer to this is let's just go back to good old-fashioned liberalism. But I think to the extent that these two kinds of post-liberalism are themselves sort of expressions of and intensifications of core commitments of liberalism, it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So I would say that there are just a couple key features of the post-liberalism that probably will be echoed by my colleagues. The first is that no political order, no human organization can be neutral. Can't be neutral. There can't be a sort of just a position where you're above it all and there's no judgment or preference being in some ways implicitly stated in that order. And I think, of course, that's true even of the kind of ideal model of the neutral liberal state. It itself is not neutral. It already contains a multitude of assumptions about the nature of human beings, what it is we are, what it is in many ways we should be. In its better forms, its more aspirational forms, it's a vision of human freedom in which we make our own choices. But to make our own choices and to genuinely make our own choices means that in many ways we have to be freed from any context in which our free choices are being limited. Now that might mean we free ourselves from a king, but it can also mean we have to free ourselves from our communities and our religions and our traditions. And you can see how this basic core commitment will work its way down to every aspect of human society and result in something along the lines of what we see today, which is the loss of so many of those key aspects of what a flourishing human life requires, the thick context of community, religious traditions, family, and so forth. And so if it's true that there is no neutral political order, then we ought to make sure that our political order is oriented to the good, to the human good. Now, of course, that's a contestable concept, but it's not one we should shy away from. We shouldn't shy away from it with the kind of conclusion, well, we don't agree, therefore let's just all agree to disagree. That's no basis for a political order, and that will set into effect its own kind of dystopic outcome. So if we are interested in supporting and advancing the human good, then we should be forthright, politically, as well as culturally, as well as socially, as well as economically, seeking the cultivation of various forms of human virtue as a condition of our flourishing. The post in post-liberal is very important because this is not, in my view, and I don't think in the view of anyone on this panel, this is not like an exercise in nostalgia. This is not like, let's just go back to 1950, let's just recreate the 1950s. This is to recognize where we are now, to recognize that we are in a very different situation. We're not putting the cell phones, they're not going away. We're not going to be confronted by an AI future. There's lots of ways in which the 1950s can't answer our questions today, but there's one key way in which the 1950s can't answer the questions right now, which is we have lived through a period of liberalism that has led to the profound disruption and even destruction of all the things that I suspect everyone in this room values, what we broadly call civil society. family, community, even nation, all of the aspects of life that are absolute requirements for a flourishing human life. And it has been a long assumption in the conservative world, and again, might be still operative in many cases here, that if we could just downsize or eliminate government, all those good things would arise via spontaneous order. And I strongly suspect that the younger you are in this room, the more you actually suspect that that is not true. In part because the younger you are facing a world in which those institutions do not exist in a functional way. They are not replicable in your own life. It is not easy to gain entry to just the basic requirements of forming a family, things like owning a home, having the financial means to start a family, having the security to start a family, having a kind of community that makes it easy or easier to start a family. And so I think the post-liberalism part, at least of this equation, is there's a strong and desperate need for the conservative world to think about the kinds of policies and reorienting what it is we're talking about. How do we actively support the restoration, and in some cases a kind of new creation or refashioning of these kinds of institutions with the assistance of the public political order. So this means we can't just fall back on a kind of knee-jerk libertarianism, government is bad. If the order can't be neutral, let's make sure it's advancing a vision and hopefully activities that are seeking the common good.
Just to follow up on that, and we might get into this later when we discuss among all three of you, do you have any specific policy recommendations for how that sort of state intervention on behalf of communities might look?
I think we'll actually get into that as we move down a little bit, but I think one thing we were even talking about this morning on our way here, wouldn't it be marvelous if we are gathered in, let's not even say 50 years, in 10 years, we're gathered here for you guys are all tenured professors with endowed chairs. That would be already good. And Wilmington is a spectacularly beautiful city. Wilmington has been restored to absolute beauty, safety, order. We could even hang around, walk around outside the DuPont Hotel. Indeed, let's go further and say we should have more buildings and more hotels like the DuPont Hotel. And here's the ultimate aim, that have bars of soap. This would be a great revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you take the next one?
Yeah.
Go to chat.
Okay.
Here.
Dr. Pecknold, then let's go to you.
Sure.
So one piece of evidence that we are increasingly living in a post-liberal age is the fact that state indifference to religion seems to be on the outs. There's evidence that we're back to a more historic recognition that politics can't be neutral about God. So what do you make of the return to public Christianity in America on the one hand, and then to the point of the panel from earlier this morning, the dramatic Islamification of Europe on the other?
Yeah, you really go for the jugular. I mean, you're right. These are kind of evidence of a collapse of liberal neutrality about religion. We just saw the Charlie Kirk Memorial was a sort of public display of senior government officials committed to public Christianity in America. There was no restraint. Marco Rubio gave a dramatic, sort of Christocentric, doctrinal oration, which I think he might be the first Secretary of State to do that from a major platform, sort of governance by a creed. On the other hand, we have a Europe which is rapidly changing. We were also just talking earlier about how grateful we are that we visited many European cities while they were still European. J.D. Vance joked at NatCon that the UK might be the first European nation, first Muslim nation with a nuclear weapon, and I think that was only partly tongue-in-cheek. Europe is rapidly becoming more Muslim. Peter Wang, he's a futurist and a demographer thinks our numbers are way off on the projections for in Islamic Europe. By 2050, we will have more Muslim babies in France than French babies. That's extraordinary. And 2050 is not that long away. So we have, I think, in the wake of liberalism's collapse, in which liberalism insisted on neutrality about everything except for itself, in which it preferred liberalism as its own comprehensive doctrine, the collapse of that is evidenced in the fact that now, instead of a veil of ignorance that we stand behind as Rawlsians, in which we are not committed to anything but the universal, now we actually have very particular, strict, comprehensive doctrines that are at play for nations, peoples, and that is itself evidence that we are no longer living in a liberal world. We are structurally in a post-liberal world. As soon as you get comprehensive doctrines that are competing for the lifeblood of nations, you are no longer liberal. You've gone through the looking glass, and now you can debate what is the good, what constitutes the good, and then you're actually back into antique conversations about what politics is. You're back into conversations about what does it mean to be a polity? What does it mean to be a commonwealth? How are you united to the good? What's your vision of the good? What's your vision of what's right? And how does that unite you in a common project? And I think we're there. We're there. And does this mean that we're going to be on the verge of a new set of crusades? That's a different sort of set of questions. What I think your question evidences is that we are no longer liberals.
So I want to ask that follow-up question. You mentioned the leaders like J.D. Vance speaking even doctrinally about Jesus Christ in the public sphere at the Charlie Kirk Memorial. And that sort of rhetoric feels new in a lot of ways, but to your point, going back millennia, in some ways that was the default position in the West. So in your mind, what principles should we be thinking about to recover a Christian approach to statecraft that is good for everyone?
Yeah, I think there's always the immediate objection that comes from the left of Christofascism, or that you're setting up a confessional state, or as if America was not predicated on Christian ideas. I think many people have now watched the Charlie Kirk video in which he talks about the 13 colonies, and the fact that I think 9 or 10 of them had Christian confessions. They began their own state constitutions with Christian confessions. This country was self-consciously both drawing on the classical and Christian tradition and thinking about what was the nature of the good they were pursuing. The founders avoided Locke's property language and preferred more classical eudaimonian happiness language of pursuit of happiness, which of course has classical resonance and Christian resonance in terms of seeking beatitude. So I think there's the sense that some people have that this is brand new, but it's in fact just a return to the American founding, and indeed the years prior to the founding, if we are through the looking glass to a post-liberal era, we're also free to no longer be held captive to the false, disordered ideas of liberalism. We no longer have to be held captive to false ideas about what liberty is. Liberty, for my guy, St. Augustine, is only possible in conformity with what's good and true. So the conversation about politics is the conversation about how do you conform not only individuals, but how do you conform a people, a community, to what's really good? And then that gets concrete when you're thinking about young families and how young families are formed and what's good for them. We're free from thinking that liberty is license, that people can just constitute themselves according to wherever their will blows. And what we've seen is that vision of liberty is destructive. It's destructive of the concrete material nature of the human person, in which you think that you can just construct out of the will what the human being is. We've seen the destructiveness in terms of building a purely aggregate of individuals who behave like a million tyrants against each other online and in real life. We don't have to live that way. We don't have to be beholden to liberal principles anymore. We can actually find the best in the classical tradition and the best in the Christian tradition to guide decisions. We don't have to apologize for thinking that Aristotle's vision is the correct one. We don't have to apologize for saying that we're going to say Merry Christmas again. We don't have to apologize for saying the state should recognize Christmas as a holiday or Easter as a holiday. So I think in a sense, the Christian statesman should feel liberated to go back to a pre-liberal past, draw principles that make life good for everybody. And I think we're now seeing atheists and Jews who would openly say, I prefer a Christian world to a Muslim one. I think I will be freer. I will be safer. I will be happier. My family will be better off. Living in a society that's determined by true Christian principles rather than one either determined by Gnostic, pantheistic, woke principles or Muslim ones.
So I have one last somewhat pointed question for you. You mentioned the founding.
Yep.
Many of us think about the founding, we think about the First Amendment. Do you think Americans can affirm a version of religious liberty that also privileges Christian faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows in the middle of the 20th century, the courts began, maybe from 47 on, began preferring a new understanding, a new kind of Rawlsian understanding of the religious freedom clause that was a negative definition, right? That we're going to be free from religion and that we're going to respect this wall of separation. And for those of you who don't know, there was a counter view. Hamburger was one of the key proponents of it that pushed against this and said, no, this was not the founders' vision. They did not have a wall of separation. The texts don't really support a wall of separation.
Chad is forgetting that this is a room of political scientists.
Oh, sorry.
Not theologians.
Sorry.
They know this.
They know this. Okay, sorry. So with this background in mind, I think we are also now free to say what J.D. Vance said at the National Prayer Breakfast, which is that the religious liberty is a liberty for the Christian worship of God, and we should be unapologetic that the state can certainly not coerce religion, but privilege it, give it benefits, acknowledge it, understand that Christianity is central to not only our history, but all of Western civilization, and it makes a contribution to our nation. It always has, and it always will.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Pappin, I'm going to turn to you now. For the last few years, you've turned your attention to being a foreign policy practitioner. What key things do you think American conservatives need to be paying attention to in international affairs? And specifically to the point of our panel, how, if at all, do current international trends relate to post-liberalism for you?
Small question. Thank you very much. No, first of all, it's really good to be back here at ISI. Thank you, Johnny, for the invitation, and congratulations for what is being built here. And I'm now 2 years into my retirement from the academy, so it's also good to be back into the environment of American academic debates like this, and it's really good that this platform exists. Well, I think I would say that even prior to working in foreign policy, I already had rather strong views about the nature, direction, and status of liberalism. And of course, I've found that all my prejudices have been confirmed by a factor of 10. That's one of the, I know it's a tendency of academics, but I think it's really the case in international affairs, and I'll try to put a point on it. I think we talk a lot about the faults of the end of history narrative, But if we think about the social and intellectual environment of the, if you will, globalist liberal elite, one really dangerous element of that thought process is the assumption that whatever we do in Western societies, we're basically going to remain number one no matter what. So we can afford to have experiments in liberty. We can afford to have a 10-year train wreck of social and marital relationships in the US. We can afford to experiment with the definition of marriage and the definition of sex because, we're rich and we're prosperous, and we might make some mistakes, but we'll get back on track. Well, I already thought that this was decadent, like intrinsically, but stepping just a little bit outside of the Western debate network, or stepping just a little bit outside of Western policymaking, it's not even taken seriously by the rest of the world. Now, in the 1990s, what we thought was that the most important thing to do was to introduce the rest of the world to the intellectual debates which built Western civilization, principally which resulted in its building liberalism, right? To spread the Whiggish narrative of history from an intellectual standpoint to the rest of the world. Well, now there's a real risk that these decisions of I'm highlighting social experimentation, if you will, but basically the experiments that are a part of the direction of Western liberalism will be fatal and will result in a non-recoverable shift in the global balance of power. Basically, we thought that history was more or less internal to the West, and we developed progress in sexual mores and liberalism, enlightenment, freedom, blah, 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 blah. And that story will just keep going. Take the issue of family policy. I've talked about it a lot. We've talked about it a lot. It's on the radar now. It's on the agenda. It absolutely was not 5 years ago. This is, in foreign affairs, this is more or less thought of until about now as an irrelevant or unrelated topic area. In the European Union, demography or family policy is a matter of national competence, doesn't have any international implications whatsoever. Well, it has huge international implications now. First of all, from a military and security standpoint, I think South Korea calculates for a standing army of 600,000 or something like that, and maybe drone technology will allow them to replace some of that. But with a rapidly cratering birth rate that's now down toward like 0.8 or something like that in South Korea, there's a real crisis on their hands. The security situation in Europe, which the Vice President pointed out at the Munich Security Conference, while we're talking all about global security and referencing the security of Europe from Russia. But what about the internal problem? Because of the catastrophic decisions that were made about migration as a replacement for continued successful Western demographic growth, concomitant with that is just a loss of sovereignty. These are countries that are not able to make sovereign decisions anymore because the consequence of their decision is their past decision is now that they have broken societies. So anyway, what I'm saying is that the threat of this kind of decadent liberalism is not just that we will remain number one and be better or worse, but actually the shifts and developments in the world system away from Western dominance are now growing in such a way that we cannot afford to continue to make those mistakes.
So in light of that, and then you mentioned the Vice President's speech at Munich, What's your take on the future of the U.S.-European alliance at this point in the second Trump administration?
Well, this is, I guess, actually the question on which I spend most of my time nowadays. My European colleagues were really, really shocked by the vice president's speech at the Munich Security Conference. And if you haven't read it, there was a subsequent excellent post on the new State Department Substack, State Department getting in on the Substack game, so by Samuel Sampson, called The Need for Civilizational Allies in Europe. So when the vice president gave this address at Munich, I mean, he's known to them, he's been going for several years. They really didn't have, if you will, the framework with which to understand what he was talking about. They viewed Trump 1.0 as an exception. It's going to go away. It's not going to come back. And when it came back, they had no idea what they were looking at. I don't mean to be or disrespectful to the European colleagues. That's just what the fact of the matter was. When he said that no one at this conference, I'm paraphrasing, but when he said no one at this conference is asking what the purpose of security is, like what is the thing that we're securing, they didn't know what he could possibly mean by that question. And the interpretation in the headlines in Europe the next day was highly transactionalist, self-interested Trump administration torches European relationship for no purpose whatsoever. Like that was the typical headline. And they're transactionalists, so if we put together a better deal, then the bad feeling will go away. Like that was the extent of the understanding. And there was something a little bit deeper going on. Obviously, we're shifting toward an era in foreign policy where, again, we can't afford the liberal idealism. We have to be more realist in our way of thinking. On the other hand, for anyone who values Western civilization or something that we call Western civilization, as I think everyone in this room does, the relationship with Europe matters, and it matters a lot for the story that the West will be able to tell about itself, that Europe not fail and not fall apart. So a little bit of tough love from the now right, hopefully more than temporarily, but like from the now righted American side is essential to that. But what I think is really happening is that there's even still today, people are expecting, well, this is still just another 4-year blip. We'll get right back to normal. The old transatlanticist movement will be back in charge in a few years. And I think that something much deeper is going on, that people in the United States felt that there was a real dislocation occurring within the country. Patrick has written about this in his most recent book, that the economy is separated from society and like becomes this other thing, and if the way we run the economy destroys the rest of society, it doesn't matter because it's following its own correct laws. So people felt that there was this real dislocation. Foreign policy was like one of the main areas where it happened, and now there's a deep desire for retrenchment. Like this, whatever role the U.S. is going to play in the world, unless it recovers its industrial capacity and some kind of political coherence, then it won't be able to function, or at least not function at its best. So what I usually tell them, the European colleagues, is there's a deep retrenchment going on. It's going to last beyond this administration, and you should be happy with it, because the world needs a good and strong America, and the lessons that are being learned rapidly, actually, in the U.S. About the failures of liberalism and the ways to recover from it. Because we have to say that, between 2020 and 2024, I think many people in this room thought, okay, well, don't know if it's recoverable. But something happened, and that, like, the little American genius of, well, actually, let's just shift completely back on track in a lot of ways, is happening.
My last question for you. Hungary's next elections are this coming April. Viktor Orban will be seeking his 5th sequential mandate since 2010. So What should we expect? And is post-liberal governance in Europe at stake in this election?
It's a very good question, and I get asked it a lot. And it's important to realize that Hungary is not an experiment in post-liberalism or any other ism that has been partially generated by American intellectual developments. It is a country, or even a small miniature civilization, since its language is completely different from everything else. It's like a little, it's like opening a box and finding a very different version of Europe, still present within Europe that you thought wasn't there, and yet it's not quite like the rest because it's not a Latin-based language, so you have no idea what's going on. So it's not an experiment in post-liberalism. No one sat down and said, well, we've been reading this great blog. One prime minister has a gift for spicy phrases, and a couple of years ago, one of his summer speeches, he really scandalized everyone by saying, what we need is illiberal democracy. And so that's what led me to apply right away. No, I'm just kidding. But this is in Hungarian. What he was trying to say was, we have a democracy in Hungary, but the good things that are in it and the freedom that is in it comes from a different source. We do not owe it to the developments of Western liberalism. We owe our Hungarian Christian freedom to ourselves. And that is a different basis which leads to different results. So that it is a country radically founded on a type of freedom. Sometimes it's called the nation of 10 million prime ministers. I mean, everyone is arguing about politics all the time, but it's a different source for freedom. So it's illiberal, meaning that the democracy that we have is not stemming from that. It's like we're subtracting that as a source. But as you can imagine, after 15 years in government, the incumbency advantage shifts a little bit, and it's very easy to identify things that you dislike with the government that is continuing. What people, I think, are realizing as they travel elsewhere in Europe is that things have gone really, really wrong. I usually tell my European colleagues that Hungary is in no way an extremist country. There is, in fact, no far right in the country whatsoever. It is a country which, because of its choices, has been able to avoid the rise of a reactionary force. There are no illegal immigrants. There are zero. And so there's no street gang trying to put order back together or something like that. So yeah, it's a European country. It has avoided some catastrophic mistakes and built a basically pro-family, pro-Christian civilization, still functioning European country. And because of that, 26 out of the 27 EU member states, there are 27, Hungary is one, but pretty much everyone else finds this inconvenient at some point. Of course, we have allies, but there are a lot of really big forces looking at you, George Soros, that have their sights trained on the country, and they will try every trick in the book between now and April. The tricks are called, there will be all sorts of tricks. These will be for the sake of preserving democracy, of course, from the dangerous continuation of the Orban government. So it's for all sorts of reasons. It's a much more contested battle this year than in previous years. But I think that Fidesz will maintain its majority And at that point, we will be able to breathe a sigh of relief because there are many signs of hope in Europe, many areas where things are quite fraught, but we have to hold on to one of these key places which has avoided some of the catastrophic decisions in recent years.
Thank you. Okay, so I have 2 questions for all 3 of you. One is more forward-looking, but before we get to that, more about the present moment. So your writings on post-liberalism, your approach to thinking about politics in general, have gotten increasing traction, including in elite political circles. And in particular, there are a lot of articles and television stories and interviews talking about your influence on the thinking of the vice president. Is this an accurate portrayal? And how do you think your ideas are likely to shape a potential Vance administration?
Let me text him and ask him. I've been asked this an awful lot by journalists all over the world. I just had a contingent of 5 journalists from Japan come to South Bend, Indiana, the direct flight from Tokyo, to meet with me to try to understand the mind of J.D. Vance. And what I told them is, look, I can attempt to explain what I know and what I understand, but if I had to explain what influences have shaped my worldview, or I think anybody in this room had to explain what are the intellectual sources of your particular worldview, it would be a complicated story. Be lots of interesting strands and streams. And so I think I can say with some confidence that my work, and doubtless the work of my colleagues, is one stream. And it's impossible for me to say quite how large of a stream that it is. But I do think that there's a very key aspect of J.D., both I just mentioned his personal biography, where he's come from, what he's experienced. And I think early in his life, and as this kind of intellectual career began, he embraced a kind of standard issue, kind of fusionist Republican view of what was happening in the place that he grew up. And then kind of gradually began to realize that there was a real fundamental disconnect between what he had been told is happening and what was actually happening. That what we needed was more free markets, more sort of neutrality on the part of the government, and then hope for the best that we would see a revival of civil society. That just didn't accord with the reality. And so I think he's someone who just came through just what his senses and his experience were telling him, came to be sort of disabused of a certain kind of faith that young conservatives were being formed in, and developed of his own accord, developed an interest in a set of questions that then there was this book and these thinkers who were attempting to answer and provide some orientation for that. And he reached out to me just a number of years ago, just wanting to talk about my book, and we spent some time together. And then when he was entering the church, I knew he was speaking to Chad, and you can talk about that, but talk to me as well. So I think somewhere in there rattling around in his mind is the way in which we've been able to help him think through in a way, how he was going to make a transition from a kind of unquestioned way of perceiving the world incorrectly to one that allowed him to see it more accurately. It's also important to stress that he is, I believe I'm correct in saying this, he is the first, certainly Republican/conservative member of our executive and first Catholic member of our executive who was shaped and formed after the Cold War and after the kind of the deepest assumptions that went into the conservative world about what it was to be an American, what it was to be someone that was opposed to the Soviet Union. And so that entire set of sort of presumptions about what it was to be a conservative just simply don't operate in the same way that they do for people of just a different generation. And those are not the waters he's swimming in. He's swimming in some very different waters. And it allows him then, I think, to understand that simply opposing government because that's collectivist, simply concluding that the use of exercise power is somehow fascist or Soviet, is not an adequate way to see the world in this born 21st century. That there are things that places like Middletown, Ohio, and places like South Bend or Wilmington really need. There are things that our young people need to be able to do the things that I think all of us in this room would want, which is, again, to form families, right? There's no better social policy for preventing all kinds of social dysfunction than to have an intact family and to be able to raise them in a sound community, something that, of course, J.D. didn't have the advantage of. So I think that just that backdrop makes him potentially a figure of enormous significance, not only because of those circumstances, but then also just the person that he is. He is someone who is just enormously intellectually interested and engaged. He is philosophically supple, but he's also, as we know, politically very shrewd and rhetorically very powerful. So he is, I do think, like some other figures we could name in American history. We could go back and talk about the Washingtons and the Lincolns and the FDRs and the Reagans. He is a generational talent. Politically, and whether he'll have the opportunity to advance, I think, his particular way of seeking to make America great again that would follow on a kind of instinctive and often rather, let's say, mercurial executive would be, I think, something to be wished for. Mm-hmm. Did you want to?
I'll just tell one story that I don't think betrays any confidence that before J.D. became a Catholic and was considering entering the church, we went out for dinner and had about a 3-hour conversation about what? Augustine's City of God. Because he had read all 1,200 pages. And he had thoughts. And he had thoughts, and he had brilliant thoughts. And I've taught City of God for almost 20 years and in seminars. He knew it as well as any of my best grad students ever knew it, inside and out. And the thing that connects to his political genius is that he actually saw one of the most critical things in the second book of the City of God, which is this Augustinian critique of why Rome fell under the weight of its own decadence, which is a common theme that we all common criticism that we all make about liberalism, that liberalism has fallen under the weight of its own decadence. And Rome falls under the weight of its own decadence in Augustine's view. And Augustine criticizes this as basically the politics of get as rich as you can and do whatever you want so long as you have consent. And that this consent-based acquisitive politics is fundamentally destructive of the good of your people. And this is precisely what he zeroed in on. It's precisely why he could ask at the Munich Security Conference, do they know what security is for? Do they know what the purpose of the security is? And that's an insight that he just immediately looked to a classic text of Western civilization and can immediately say, here's its relevance for our polity today. And we need that kind of statesman. We need a kind of Christian statesman who's willing to just plunge down, read 1,200 pages, and think, what's the principle that we need to right our own ship?
Yeah, I think that the journalists who ask these questions are a little bit late to the game, and trying to put together their architecture of the different strains of the conservative movement. I think it's pretty obvious that the number one most influential person in the circle of conservative intellectuals and J.D. is J.D. himself. He is in fact the person in that larger group, which includes, I think, everyone in this room who is charting a particular kind of political path. He's not standing at the helm of the state, suffering that. Like the two red button memes, like with the sweat pouring down, is like, am I doing a post-liberalism or am I doing a liberalism? Is not worried about that because we all know the basic direction of travel that's necessary, and there are tons of very important practical questions to debate, tons of important strategic questions that are not answered by an intellectual framework. But to put one point on it, which is probably also raises a lot of questions. He's managed to stitch together a lot of different parts of the conservative coalition into a new synthesis, or he has contributed to that. So from his work in finance and in Silicon Valley, he's helped to draw in the right-wing tech bros and make them part of the coalition. And when he's speaking to ordinary people in Ohio, as he was when he was a senator, it's something different because he has a number of different backgrounds from the deindustrialized area, participating in the military during the American democratization wars or neoconservative wars, seeing the shift of the economy to the tech service sector completely disconnected from the rest of the economy, and now he wants to help make it real. So he's doing a lot, and it's something that we should all be happy with, I think.
Okay, the final question relates to the topic of the panel, which is our post-liberal future. So I want to tap into your wildest professional dreams and think about what happens if post-liberalism, as you all formulate it, becomes a highly influential movement in American politics.
Continues to be.
Continues to be. Advanced by, let's say, 2 terms of a post-liberal Vance presidency, potentially a successor as well. It becomes, just like the philosophy of progressivism shaped administrations from Wilson to FDR, or let's say Buckley-inspired fusionism. So if we all come back to APG in 50 years, and we're looking back
I'll be very old.
and we look at 50 years of achievements of post-liberalism, the United States will be about to turn 300. What will we be talking about? What will be the achievements that you all are hoping for?
Gabby, thank you for asking that question that I planted. This was actually my proposed topic for the entire panel, and then my colleagues said, no, we should actually talk about what it is we think. But I wanted to pose this question to us, and I realize we're starting to run short on time, but because I think too often when conservatives get together, we spend a lot of time talking about either Xenophon, who's great, or we talk a lot about how we're going to get the American founding right this time, or we talk about, I don't know, whatever it is we talk about. But we don't often talk about what our vision for America is in 50 years. What it is we want to see. What's the aim, right? Aristotle says, right? Every action has an aim. It aims toward a goal. You aim the arrow toward the target. And we may fall short in that, and certainly, doubtless, we will. But what is it? What is it we want to be celebrating in 50 years? What is it our tercentenary will be celebrating? And here I think the things that we've been talking about would give us some indication of that. And those would be, I spent last year in Boulder, Colorado. I was teaching, I was the conservative chair at the University of Colorado. And people kept giving me their condolences. Oh, how terrible, living in Boulder, Colorado. A progressive town, all those liberals. Every house has that sign up, in this house we believe. And my experience of living in Boulder, Colorado is that, notwithstanding all the signs, I haven't lived in as conservative a town since growing up in Windsor, Connecticut in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a remarkably conservative town in the sense that it was orderly, it was safe. Your kids would walk to school. We lived close to the middle school. They would be walking by every morning. There was a sense of responsibility to the community. People were active in believing that they could help and assist the flourishing of Boulder. But it's a luxury good. It costs you at least $1 million to get into that way of life now, which used to just be an ordinary, everyday American life for families, parents that would want to raise family in that kind of an atmosphere. And so the signs that are out are a bit like the blood you put above the lentil, which is that, don't notice us here. It's just us progressive liberals, all of us egalitarians who are living this idyllic conservative life but don't want the rest of you to find out about it. Meanwhile, we're going to support disorder. We're going to politically support disorder everywhere else in the country, and certainly in the cities. and in some ways make sure that we will continue to win politically without having to bear any of the costs of those victories. So what would we be celebrating in 50 years? Where once again, any ordinary citizen who wanted to could live in that kind of a community and raise a family in that kind of community. And it's going to be a big pull, because here I do not think that spontaneous order is going to do it. I do think we are going to need to shift the work of both state governments and federal governments, as well as tremendous efforts on the part of all the various associations in America to make this possible. But this should be like one of our fundamental priorities, which is just making this a public utility. And if you want to have a conservative future, if you want to be celebrating that in 50 years, that's what we should be aiming at. This, of course, is going to involve shifting what it is education is, and I'm really delighted to some extent to see that this is happening, at least in some of the red states. I think more will need to be done on that front. I think Chad doubtless will speak on the ways in which this is also going to require our ability to make acknowledgement of America as having these roots in a very substantive tradition, not just an abstract tradition of ideas, but a substantive tradition of practice, of a kind of history, and of course Christianity will once again have to be second nature for us. It won't even be thought about. We won't even be having conversations about whether you can say Merry Christmas. People will just say it. Right? It will just be a default. I think all of these things require us then to rethink, as conservatives, to rethink the ways in which, I think this has been the theme of the panel, rethink the ways in which we are all part of and responsible for the public order. And it can't simply be a collection of individuals who organize on the principle of a kind of non-aggression pact or indifference to each other. That rather the organizational principle of any flourishing political order is the common good, with a stress here on the common. We've been talking a lot about the good, but I think a stress on the common helps us understand the nature of that good, which is always the question and the test: how are the commoners doing? How are ordinary people doing? And if conservatives haven't been asking that question first and foremost, then we are not, in some ways, doing the work of what it is to conserve. The commoners have not been doing well in our country, and we actually bear some responsibility for that in our participation in a liberal order that emptied out and devastated major parts of our country. But I do not think, maybe unlike some of the worries we have for Europe, I do not think it is too late for this country. I think we have tremendous resources, not just economically, of course, but we have tremendous resources historically and as a matter of national pride, and just kind of muscles that haven't been exercised for us to exercise some kind of a recovery and the launch of a new ideal of a kind of common good that I hope it is what we'll be celebrating in 50 years.
I've always, in our name, post-liberal order, I've always been more attracted to the order part than the post-liberal part. I've always thought post-liberal is a kind of negative descriptor. And it's important to recognize, I think, and I think we try to do that, but order is an Augustinian word for me. It's obviously also a classical word, but thinking in Augustinian terms about order as something which orders souls in a common enterprise has to have God as the sort of bond between people and nations. And so the idea of an order of charity, an order of love in America is, I think, in 50 years, I would like some sort of positive understanding of Christian charity that was tied to order and right order, instead of some idea of Christian charity that was tied to sort of dissolving our nation. And the way in which we have sort of liberalized our notion of charity, so that now charity, an order of charity means open borders, means kindness and fairness to everybody except for your own people, means that actually by 2050, we might not be producing our own babies, because of our positions on abortion or IVF or what have you. This is what my ideal vision is a recovery of a Christian vision of order, and a Christian vision of order that is objectively tied to actual order, so that our cities are safe, so that our cities are places where families can flourish again, that aren't sort of drug-addled streets with tent villages under underpasses where I can't take my kids. This is, I think, a kind of vision of Christian charity which makes our cities safe again, which makes our cities conservative again. When was the last time you thought of a city as conservative? Why is that? Why can we not think about the city as conservative? Is that just sort of writ into the DNA of the West? I don't think so. And so to recover a vision, a Christian charitable vision of order in the city where conservatives run cities again, maybe they need 10 years of the federal government coming in and bringing some troop assistance to help aid that process. But at some point, conservatives need to run cities again, and they need to run cities in a way which makes churches flourish, which makes families flourish. One hope is for a recovery of the city, and then, of course, a recovery of the small town. And that's I think, very much tied to reindustrialization. We need lots of factories. We need, I was just looking at a statistic that to have fought World War II, we needed about 10,000 steel factories. And now we have 2. We can't fight another Second World War if we wanted to, because we don't actually have the industrial capacity to do it. And so a major reinvestment in creating industries that serve the nation would revitalize the small town, the main street, for the good of family formation. And the common theme of recovering the city and the town is, of course, the family and the church.
I hadn't thought about this question until a few weeks ago when I had to do this interview with this guy at the New York Times whose podcast is called The Next American Story, and so you have to come up with your next American story. But it seems to me, this is what I thought in reflecting on that, is that basically the situation is that we're not in control of ourselves, and we're not in control of our own destiny at the moment, and we have to be. And so if we get back on track, then we will once again be masters of our own destiny. Now, I have mixed feelings about the whole manifest destiny thing from the 19th century, but at least someone had a clear vision of what they wanted and what they wanted to do. And the situation now is that we're in fact exposed in myriad ways. Well, what happened yesterday, there's this back and forth between China and the Trump administration over China's imposition of export controls on partner countries of stuff made with rare earth minerals that were unearthed in China. Well, this is a huge area of exposure. We're not in control of ourselves if we are heavily reliant on adversaries and challengers at critical points in all of our supply chains. I mean, we can talk about, freedom, and we can talk about how great our country is and all that, but come on, in any kind of crisis, we're heavily exposed, and we can be grateful in a way that COVID exposed that, because that's when people started thinking about this. There was a public tender in the city of Fort Worth during COVID for masks, like say what you will about masks, but the Fort Worth company offered to make all the masks that Texas needed at $2.50 a mask for the advanced N95 masks or whatever, and they instead went with a Chinese supplier for $2 a mask because it would be interference within the market to subsidize that at 50 cents a mask in order to have them produced like around the corner in Fort Worth. So even ideologically we sabotaged ourselves. And that decision is just an emblem of it. So once we have to put ourselves back together. That means returning to family strength and industrial strength, and then we can decide what to do. Maybe that means, as I think it probably does, retrenchment, more focus on the Western Hemisphere. But right now, the U.S. is in a situation where it has had in a way, a target on its back for a very long time. Just like with little Hungary, there are many people who want the U.S. to be sabotaged. Like there are many people who have been trying to destroy it, both foreign and domestic, as they used to say. And people are trying to pull us into wars that we don't want to be involved in. They're trying to keep us in structures that no longer serve our interests. And in the meantime, if push came to shove and we actually had to rely on ourselves for whatever the rare earth minerals that are actually out somewhere in, I don't know, Mountain West, deep underground, but we can't touch them because of the environmental laws, well, we're screwed. So if we can put ourselves back together, if we can focus on that again, then fast forward 50 years, we will be in control of our destiny.
I think that's a good, okay, yes, I think we're at time. That's a great note to end on. So please join me in thanking our panelists. This was great.
And Gabby, thank you.
Thank you.